All right, good morning, everybody. So, I'm going to continue in Paul's letter to the Galatians today, and just kind of a summary and setup here. Paul was submitting his message that the glorified Jesus Christ gave him, the gospel of the uncircumcision, to those of the circumcision, to Cephas, John, and James. Cephas is another name for Peter, I believe, and even if it's not, it doesn't really matter. But why they would use different names there, I'm sure there's a whole study on that, and I'm sure people know it, and I'm sure that I don't care, 'cause it just doesn't matter. But I do believe that Cephas is Peter, and so the pillars of the circumcision gospel, those who walked and talked with Jesus while he was on earth and preached the message that Jesus preached while he was on earth. The big time guys, the pillars, Peter, James, and John, were of the circumcision. They had a message based on accepting Jesus Christ as the Messiah and performing certain works of law in order to attain righteousness. Whereas Paul's message from the glorified Christ was one of pure, unadulterated grace, apart from any and all works of law. And by the way, Christians, and I've heard this argument a lot, that they separate the different laws, like the circumcision law, the 613 laws are were different from the 10 commandments. We don't have to keep the 613 laws, but we do have to keep the 10 commandments. No. Paul's message is apart from any and all law. Anything that is not grace is foreign to Paul's message. If you look at Romans chapter 7, when Paul is talking about law, he makes a specific reference to the law he's talking about. What law is he talking about? He says in verse 7 and 8 of Romans chapter 7, "May it not become to that, but sin I knew not except through law. For besides I had been aware of coveting, I had not been aware of coveting, except the law said, you shall not be coveting." So Christians say that the law is separate and you still have to keep the 10 commandments. Well, you shall not be coveting. Where have I heard that before? Where have I heard that? Oh, yeah. Last I checked, that's part of the 10 commandments. So any and all law, I don't care if you're talking about the circumcision law, Mosaic law, the 10 commandments, Paul is illustrating that any and all law, anything that is not grace, is not a part of his message. As he said in the previous verse, we are exempted from law because of what Jesus Christ did. Just a side note. But moving on here in Galatians chapter 2, verse 7. So after presenting all of this and his message, submitting it to Peter, James, and John, we go into verse 7. "But on the contrary, perceiving that I have been entrusted," this is Paul talking, "with the evangel of the uncircumcision, according as Peter of the circumcision. For he who operates in Peter for the apostleship of the circumcision operates in me also for the nations." Now, the word "of" there, Paul is entrusted with the gospel of the circumcision, Peter with the gospel of the circumcision. The word "of" means there's a difference in the message. Of circumcision and of uncircumcision means there's a different message. Christians and religious people try to put the word "to" in there, meaning that Paul was just entrusted to the uncircumcision, which is just taking the same message to the nations, and that Peter was entrusted with the message to the circumcision, which is just giving the same message to those in Israel. But the word used here is of, so that signifies a difference in the message, not just based on where the message is going. It's not the same message going to different people, it's a different message going to different people. And that's proven in the rest of chapter 2 here, in the next two paragraphs. And I'm just going to read it word for word because this will clear up any doubt that there was a different message going on here. And remember, this is Peter, James, and John that Paul is comparing his message to. He gave the message to Peter, James, and John, and this is the reaction and the conflict that ensues. And knowing, this is verse 9, and knowing the grace which is being given to me, James, Cephas, and John, who are supposed to be pillars, give to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. So they approve his message. That we indeed are to be for the nations, yet they for the circumcision. Only that we may be remembering the poor, which same thing I endeavor also to do. Remember, Peter said in his letters that there are things in Paul's evangel that were difficult to understand. So I've yet to hear any Christian or anyone who doesn't believe in the difference between the gospel of the circumcision and uncircumcision explain why Peter would see things in Paul's message that were difficult to understand if it was the same message. And they'll continue to ignore it, and I'm sure I won't get an answer for that, ever. Going into verse 11. Now when Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, for he was self-censured. For before the coming of some from James, he ate together with those of the nations. Yet when they came, he shrank back, and severed himself, fearing those of the circumcision. This is Peter. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that Barnabas, Paul's right-hand man, was also led away with their hypocrisy. But when I perceived that they are not correct in their attitude toward the truth of the evangel, I said to Cephas in front of all, if you, being inherently a Jew, are living as the nations and not as the Jews, how are you compelling the nations to be Judaizing? Okay, so what's going on here? After Paul submitted his message, his evangel, to Peter, James, and John, Peter came down to hang out with the Galatians. And he was eating with them. Everything was fine. And then when the people from the circumcision came, from James, the chief of the apostles, Peter, got intimidated and shrunk back and stopped eating with those of the nations because he feared what the people from James would think. Okay, and it's not, we have to understand when people say that, oh yeah, Paul was just bringing the same message to the nations as Peter was to the Jews. We have to understand that that cannot possibly be true. Because if James, the group from James came down and Peter got scared because the people of James didn't want him eating with people of the nations, just because they were of the nations, they were Gentiles and they were Jews. It was a race thing. But that's not what Paul says here. If you look at verse 14. But when I perceived, because Paul withstood Peter and called him out on this behavior. And this is what he says. But when I perceived that they, this is Peter and Barnabas and the rest, well, Barnabas was taken away, as was Peter. They were all intimidated, apparently, by those of James and the law keepers. But when I perceive that they are not correct in their attitude towards the truth of the evangel, I said to Cephas, Peter, in front of all. So the issue was not that they were racist in that they were Jews and now the message was going to the Gentiles. That's not what Paul said. Paul said, I perceive they are not correct in their attitude toward the truth of the evangel. Whose evangel? Paul's evangel. So James and those coming down and Peter were rejecting the evangel. Not the fact that the same message was going to the Gentiles, but it was the evangel that their attitude was wrong about. Why was their attitude wrong about it? Paul explains it in this letter clearly. It was injecting law into Paul's message of grace. And when those of the law came down, Peter shrank back. They stole Barnabas and other believers because they were getting them to Judaize or getting them to come back under law when Paul's message is completely of grace. And that's exactly what is done today. Anytime someone tries to say that you have to follow commandments, any law, in order to get the righteousness of Jesus Christ or in order to maintain the righteousness of Jesus Christ. Paul's message is one of complete, ridiculous, unadulterated grace. And the people of law and the people of James in this day and the Christians of today can't handle that because they need to be able to do something to show their worthiness in order to complete the cross of Jesus Christ. And Paul is keeping that out of his message. And we are keeping it out of our message that the Apostle Paul has given to us. We attain our righteousness by the faith of Christ, his death, his entombment, and his resurrection. And we participate with him in that and attain our righteousness based on his work, apart from law, by grace through faith, through Jesus Christ's faith. And any attempt to bring law into our message needs to be defended at all cost.